Welcome back to our grand 4-part series. Today we're going to be discussing the recording phase of Frostfell, and just recording in general. And I decided we'd break this down into 4 relatively short parts. The first one being part preparation, how we prepare our score for our players. The second will be session preparation, so how we actually prepare the project files themselves. The third is going to be our choice on recording equipment. I have one of my mics here, but we'll talk about some different mic options and the ones that I use for my album. And then the fourth is going to be the actual session itself and discussing some considerations for how you should actually run a session. This is going to be a little bit of show and tell in here, so we'll actually show some of the mics, we're going to show some of the project files, etc. Let's jump in. So part preparation. This is super important. Having an organized score isn't just for you to have something that's aesthetically pleasing and looks good. It's so that your player can work through the score as quickly as possible and ensure that your session is not taking up excessive time just trying to sift through mistakes on the score or just unclean parts. I like to treat every session as if it was costing me $100 a minute. My ultimate goal is to work with full orchestras someday in the hopefully not too far future, and those sessions can be very expensive, very, very expensive. I like to treat my sessions in the same way, and to the best of my ability, make sure that everything is clean, legible, ready to go. So a couple ways we do that. Number 1, we only put as much ink on the page as we need to convey the ideas. Writing for commercial music, the scores are not the same as writing for classical music. In classical scores, we're used to seeing things that are a bit more artistic, maybe certain text descriptions, a lot of dynamics or articulations. But in commercial music, we're trying to keep that as concise as possible. So it might make sense to write, if you have a whole section that's staccato, just to simply write staccato and then indicate when that ends, as opposed to writing out all the notes. Anything that can give the player a shortcut, a way to be able to read more quickly, is very useful. The other way we can do that is to make sure that our page turns are set at proper positions on the score. In most cases, the pieces on Frostfell were about 3 pages, so I was able to fit them onto a stand. I've done part prep for scores where the violin has 9 pages. And in that case, you could expect there's gonna be some page turns. So making sure that they can turn their page at a reasonable part in the score when they're prepared is very useful. Rehearsal markings are also incredibly useful, particularly for longer scores. It allows you both to reference a letter in the score that usually is placed near a section break. So if you have a new section coming up, you might want to put a rehearsal marking. That way you can say, hey, let's check out one measure before B. Also making sure that your measure numbers are on every measure and very, very legible and big is useful as well. You don't want to have a player looking to find where the measures are and taking up excessive time. It's easier just to say 17 or 4 before E. Moving on to session prep. This is equally important, if not more important, to the score prep. Again, we're trying to save the player and ourselves as much time during the recording session as possible. And the best way we can do this is to ensure that all of our project files are opening properly, that we're minimizing the load-in time. So if you have plugins that take a really long time to load on your computer, you might want to bounce it out into audio so that when you open up the file, it's opening as quickly as possible. We also want to make sure that our measure numbers in the project file correspond to our measure numbers in the score. This was a mistake that I used to make quite a bit and I've started to avoid. It's really, really tricky when you're like, what is this spot? This is 3. No, this is measure 4. And you're trying to correspond between the two. So always make sure that they sync up. If you have pickups, you might need to work in your DAW to actually drag the project back a little bit so that you have a little bit of lead-in time before measure 1 starts. When you're composing, keeping the session in mind is also very useful. I was always thinking about what the process would be like to record these tracks in the sessions while I was writing the pieces. And oftentimes that means working very closely with a click track. Click tracks can be a really good friend for us as a composer, but they can also be very troublesome, especially if we're writing ambient music. So sometimes my process varies. Sometimes I'll be working with a click throughout the whole piece. And for ambient stuff, or maybe more rubato sections, I'll sometimes play in the pieces myself, and then I will actually map the click afterwards. A bit more time consuming, but you need to have a click in place, even for big speed up, slow down sections, just so that your player has something to work with. And it makes the editing process easier. That way you can figure out where these downbeats are falling. Also, on the point of click, one thing that I learned particularly during these sessions was that different instrumentalists have different preferences when it comes to the click. So making sure your click is accessible and that you can change things like the pitch of it or the volume very quickly is really useful. For example, the cellist that I was working with noticed that where the click was sitting was a bit hard to hear because registerally the pitch was landing right where the cello was. So for her, what we had to do was bump the click up in pitch, so it was a little higher in pitch, a little bit louder than the rest of the tracks. Having a blank audio file indicated with the instrument you plan on recording or instruments, record enabled and ready to go is super useful as well. You don't have to be creating a track every time. And for Frostfell, what I did was I actually made something. Once I got the EQ presets the way I liked it, I actually saved out the EQ presets during the session and then loaded in the EQ presets to each track for each next project. So that way when I found the EQ that was just generally working for the flute, I would just save that, then go, okay, well, let's record the next track, pop that EQ back in, we're good to go. And it just saves a little bit of time on the mixing end as well. Punch in. Punch in is super useful and important. So you want to give your players some lead in time. You don't want to say, let's record at measure 14, and then you hit record and measure 14 starts. You need to have a lead in time. Not too long, not too short. Sometimes I've gone for just a measure before, so 4 clicks usually. Sometimes I've gone for 2 beats if I want it to be quick. And there's ways you can cycle through those settings in your respective DAW. I use Logic, and so I've just changed the punch-in time to 4 clicks. The last thing you could do probably to stay organized in your project files would be to have some sort of markers, ways to indicate these different sections in the same way that you would do it with rehearsal markings in the score. So if you want to be really good, correspond your rehearsal markings to markers in the score and allow it so that you can quickly cycle between these different marker points. Again, the priority of all of this is expedience, both out of courtesy for the player and just to make the process as smooth as possible. The quicker you can get these things to be, the more streamlined you are, the more you can focus on the creative things and the fun things. Microphones. Let's talk microphones. So this is a very important part of the recording process, obviously. The kind of mic that we choose to use for an instrument can dramatically affect the overall color, the warmth, the brightness, punchiness, all these sorts of things. There are more microphones than what I'm about to talk about, obviously. I have a relatively small arsenal of microphones. I have 2 large diaphragm condenser microphones, and I have 2 small diaphragm condenser microphones. All of them are created by Rode. This is not a sponsorship or anything like that. I used to own the Rode NT1A, which is this guy. I guess I still do own it. And I liked the sound of it so much that I decided to buy the NT1, which is the mic that I'm recording my voice with. After that, I decided I would try some small diaphragms, and I actually bought these small diaphragms specifically for the Frostfell sessions because I knew I was going to want them. So I got these guys here. They are the Rode M5s, and they are small diaphragm condenser microphones. All these are relatively affordable. I wasn't quite prepared to go into the high tier mics yet. These were right in my price point. If you choose to purchase these mics, do me a favor and purchase them through the links that I have in the description, because that'll give me a little teensy tiny incentive bonus that I can buy my coffees with. Also, I should mention that these 2 microphones, they are separate, of course, but I have them mounted in a way that they are working as a stereo pair. So what are the differences between these 2 microphones? I am not a recording engineer, so I'm not going to try and speak about more than what I know. But I can tell you that from what I understand, the small diaphragms typically capture a more accurate image, like an EQ of the sound. So you're going to be able to get better transients, so you get more highs with this than you would with a large diaphragm mic. A lot of people like the large diaphragms because of the kind of inherent warmth that it brings the recordings. That seems to kind of round everything out a little bit. So when it comes to vocals or things similar to vocals, I'll usually go with a large diaphragm. I use large diaphragms for guitars, occasionally for piano. Obviously I use them for vocals as well. I actually wound up using them, I think, for all of the musicians because I wanted a warm sound. Small diaphragm, on the other hand, I found gave a much better image when it came to things like glockenspiel or other percussion instruments. I think that it captured the transients better, so I got nice crispness without it getting like tinny or pinch sounding. I'm gonna demonstrate how some of these mics sound different from each other with a glockenspiel and maybe a couple other instruments. Again, before your session, make these considerations. Buffer in like a half hour for each session just to set up mics, to figure out what mics you're going to use, and make sure that those are set correctly and that you're happy with the sound. Don't think, oh, we'll fix it in post, because if there's a mistake that's not correctable, it's going to really screw up your mix. And lastly, the recording session. So I'll just talk about a couple little anecdotes, things that happened for me during my recording sessions for this album, maybe things that are interesting or things that I learned. Each of the instruments were recorded separately, all of them here in my home studio except for the clarinet. My clarinet player had requested that he work remotely in a session, which was totally fine by me. So Ronnie, my flute player, was the first to record, and we worked with a large diaphragm condenser mic. It was this mic here, actually. We had it spaced just a couple feet away from her. And I chose the large diaphragm because I wanted a kind of warmer sound for her performance. We finished a bit early, so one thing I had her do was actually spend about 15 minutes recording a couple free-form solos. I told her to solo in Dorian. Keep playing, improvise. So we did that for a while. And that's actually what you hear in the Ice Cave. There's a section where everything starts to break into a new moment. And what I did was I took 4 of her samples, her recordings of improv, I pitched them down to B Dorian, and I overlapped them all with each other and had them panning and stuff like that. So if you have extra time during your sessions, I definitely recommend getting a little bit of extra material, even if you're not sure if you'll use it or not. Yo recorded the violin 1, violin 2, and viola. And with him, we did a somewhat similar mic position, although retrospectively, I might have tried the small diaphragm mic. Yo's session went great. He was probably recording the longest because he's recording 3 instruments. One thing we did with Yo that I specifically remember was the Gates of Frostfell, the very ending. We wanted to try some kind of cool effect, and we both collaborated and discovered that we could do these kind of portamento harmonic like glisses. So we were doing, which was originally intended just to be regular notes, just played arco. But we tried it with these harmonics, and Yo was able to capture that really just glassy effect that I wanted. So when you have the players, always be open-minded, always collaborate with them, in my opinion. You can create some really cool effects and do things that you couldn't dream of if you have the players in the room. That's gonna do it for part 3. Hopefully you found this interesting. I really live for these kinds of sessions. Working with great musicians is my favorite thing of composing, honestly. It's why I love orchestra so much, because these players can just bring such life to our music. And I really, really enjoy any opportunity to work with them. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments section. We will jump into part 4 probably sometime next week and talk about the mixing, the mastering, and the end.